Yeah, good evening to all. I welcome you to our common event occupied by Empowered, how the Soviets redefined women in Austrian politics. And I do it on behalf of two organizations, the Dialogbüro Vienna and Denkfabrik of our partner Artem Kochnev. And very warm welcome our speaker, Olga Malashkina from the University of Vienna. I'm Stefan Melle, the head of Dialogbüro Vienna, and this is the first of three events which we will hold on the much more bigger topic of Austria from 1945 to 1955. That is a time of occupation, you understand. And this was the making of the Second Republic of Austria. Good evening. Yes, and this context of the today event is, of course, also that we remember the end of the Second World War, and it was just 80 years ago. And of course, it is occasion to remember this whole Second World War, and yes, also the German fascist regime, where the Austrians really took part quite actively. On 13th of April in 1945 ended the war in Vienna. That was the last armed fighting. On 15th was handed over the city, but the capitulation of this German and Austrian Reich was only in the beginning of May, you know. However, the start of the Second Republic was already in the 20th of April. It started just after the end of the fight. And yes, that was a time of ending horrible crimes of the Germans, of the Austrians, of all the allies. And you can find a lot of materials on these questions in these days, wherever in the media, in museums, and there are a lot of special articles and also exhibitions. That was based on the Anschluss, you know, in 1938. As we read, there wasn't any strong resistance. Maybe wasn't any resistance. Yeah, so Austrians welcomed this, as it was named then reunification. This was really war crimes. It was a lot of crimes against humanity. It was participation in the Holocaust. For instance, in the concentration camps Mauthausen, Gusen, and others. And just today, the newspaper The Standard published a huge article on one of these cases about the gruesome secret of SS mass murderer Walter Rauff, who is in Austria. He was, from 1941 onwards, responsible for the development and use of mobile gas vans, which were used not only in the occupied Soviet Union for the mass murder of Jews and Sinti and Roma, but in a lot of territories. It's really worth to read, a long read, but it shows this inclusion also of this country in this fascist regime. Today we have to remember also the Hitler-Stalin Pact, because that was concluded between both regimes, both dictatorships. And only from 1941, the Soviet Union was on the other side. It became also a victim. It became a part of the anti-Hitler coalition, together with the United States, with the United Kingdom. And this was already another fight. It was not against Poland. It was already for freeing all these countries and the own country too. I say it because we have another context today too, when the Russian Federation, who is partially a successor of the Soviet Union, is again in a war, but is aggressor against Ukraine. It's not the first aggression. We had already earlier against Georgia. We have almost occupied Belarus. And this was connected with a certain change. After 1945, there was a common understanding that such mass murdering, such war should happen never again. But never again was the most important conclusion. And later, under the regime of Vladimir Putin, it became step by step a new slogan: we can do it again. And that is the attempt to explain or to put the Ukraine in the public understanding as a alleged new Nazi regime. But to be honest, the Putin regime ideology and the actions at home and also abroad, and also their crimes, everyday crimes, are becoming more and more similar to those of the Nazis in the 30s and 40s. Of course, we understand that any comparison will be not equal, yeah, it's clear. However, we should see also this connection. And for today, already more than 100,000 people died, and hundreds of thousands others are heavily injured. For instance, in the recent day, we had again dozens of murdered in Sumy, in Dnipro, in Kiev, and in other cities. And it's just today the day when the United States, the former anti-Hitler ally, proposed officially the violation of international law as an alleged solution for the war. The attempt to recognize the annexed Ukrainian Peninsula Crimea as a part of Russian Federation. And it's very strange that just Crimea is a second part. This point where the post-war European order might be fixed. That was so in 1945, 44, and now it's again, yes, together by Russia and the United States. It's a new crime. I invite you at this moment to hold a minute of silence for all the victims of the regimes then and today, for the murdered people then and today.
Thank you, Stefan. It's a big pleasure to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to conduct this lecture, because this is the result of my big work, and I'm really happy that I can communicate and share my academic research within this lovely studio, this lovely Denkfabrik organization and Dialog Bureau organization. Indeed, my name is Olga. I'm a historian and a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna. where I'm finalizing my thesis on the occupation of Austria and Soviets' presence here in Austria during 1945 and 1955. And we know that this year Austria celebrates the 80th anniversary of the creation of the Second Republic, the end of Anschluss, and 70 years since the State Treaty or Staatsvertrag signature and gaining its sovereignty back. So we all expect exhibitions, conferences, shows, and of course you understand that over the past decades hundreds of books have been written and thousands of articles have been published. So it seems like everything has already been discovered. But my intuition told me no, there is something which still Austrians don't know about themselves, don't know about the Soviet presence. So I was thinking about what was that they don't know about. Politics, culture, so economics, I thought, and gender studies. I started my investigation, and here is the big result of what I discovered. Though you may ask me why I investigate the Soviet side in particular, just because Soviets were different from other allies. They had different economic system, common economy. They had different political ideology, which was socialism. And finally, the Soviet documents were inaccessible the longest. And moreover, I know Russian to read them, I should say. So the task of a historian is to work in archives, to work with primary data, with primary sources. And again, here is the big part of a big work and results which I discovered. So how the Soviets redefined women in Austrian politics. And this is what I'm going to share with you today. So the political landscape after the Second World War and the circumstances of the Second Republic creation. The first Austrian parliamentary elections and their results. So how communists changed their tactics after the elections and how they created new movements. The influence of economy environment in Austria after the Second World War, and the 70s, when the SPO took advantage and made its move. I told you that Austria in 1955 and 1945 got its sovereignty back, which means that one day Austria lost it. Indeed, Austria lost its sovereignty in 1938 in Anschluss. Here is the map from the Austrian School Atlas, dated 1938, showing you Austria in Anschluss, which means Austria joined to Germany. So where Austria here exactly? Austria is here with its capital Wien. On the other side would be Innsbruck. Though such a country did not exist anymore, it even lost its name. It got name a province called Ostmark. So even no name existed. Austria lost its democratic laws. So everything was lost forever. And allies at that time, after the start of the Second World War, especially in 1941, the allies, the US, Great Britain, and Soviet Union wanted to liberate this territory, so to declare Anschluss null and void. So, in the spring 1945, the Allies launched an offensive, during which the Soviet army occupied Vienna, the whole Lower Austria, and there in Lower Austria, in the city called Glognitz, Soviet troops met Karl Renner. I brought for you a brochure from the museum where he was exactly captured. Glognitz is an amazing town with an amazing museum, and these leaflets you can find at the entrance, just right at the entrance, and visit that museum. So after capturing of Karl Renner, he was moved to the to various administrations of Soviet troops and later to Vienna. So there he was the one who was appointed by Stalin as a provisional chancellor. And since then, Austria returned back its sovereignty. By autumn 1945, allies entered Vienna. I would say Soviet Union allowed them to enter Vienna and set the date for the parliamentary elections. The date was November 25th. And these were the first parliamentary, I would say, democratic elections right after 1930. Here we have the scheme of the next processes that Austrians faced. I told you about the elections. And the election date, that was November 25. But we all know that election, and we choose from the parties. But during Anschluss, all the parties, you understand, were abolished. There were no parties, there was only one, NSDAP. So the task for Karl Renner was to restore these parties. And the question is, how it was possible to restore parties that still didn't exist. But the process was pretty interesting. So, by mid-April, leaders of the Communist Party, KPO, arrived from Moscow, where they lived at Tverskaya Street during the whole time of Anschluss. So they returned to Moscow right from Tverskaya Street. That's important to note that their newspapers, I would say Soviet-controlled newspapers, were following Österreichische Volksstimme and Österreichische Zeitung. They are important because when you see the documentary, please look which newspapers are shown or on either on video or photos, because that's important to know what stays behind these newspapers. So these were two belonging to KPO and of course controlled by Soviet Union. So by mid-April, the SPO was found. They got a bit slightly different name because before they were called the Social Democratic Work Party, while now they only got the name SPO, Social Party, so Socialists. And their newspaper was Arbeiter Zeitung, which is still important to remember. And the final party that was restored was the Conservative Party, Volkspartei. To tell the truth, they, apart from SPO and KPO, they changed their ideology completely, because earlier, in 1934, they were for Austrofascism. They supported Austrofascist party here in Austria, and of course didn't want to connect their new movement, new party, with previous activities. That's why they got new name and some new aspects of ideology. Their newspaper was Wiener Kurier. So, you see three parties, but there is no, I would say, the fourth, the right-wing party, because the right-wing movements were strongly prohibited in May 1945, and we understand why. So all Nazi parties were prohibited. That's why Austria, by April 45, had only these three. So these three parties, the parliament, Karl Renner proclaimed the creation of the Second Republic in Austria on the 27th of April, which is in 3 days. So Austria, apart from the election of Mikhail Ludwig, will have yet another celebration. So here is the video, archival video for you. So let me show you the first photo. This is how the election were in process, but apart from the photo, I have something to show you. That's archival video. And let's have a look, because this is what I downloaded for you. Nobody knows what the result will be. There are no public polls. No one knows the result. We only know that the turnover and the attendance was pretty high. It was over 90%. The last person you saw at this video was Leopold Figl. And he mentioned here, just because that was his party, Volkspartei, that won these elections with approximately 50%. The second place took Social Democratic Party, SPO, and the communists took a little bit higher than 5%. Of course, the USSR was shocked by these election results because they were expecting 20%. Now we know this from archival documents, but got just over 5%. And we have a very vivid evidence of Soviet reaction to this result. The evidence of the program director of Radio Vienna, who experienced this reaction. So the morning after the election, the Soviet censor Goldenberg showed up at the radio committee at the station and asked about the results that were already in hands of this radio committee. And the director of Radio Vienna said, well, we already know that the Volkspartei got 35 seats in the parliament, Social Democrats got 25 seats, and KPO got only 3. So at this time, Goldenberg calls to his office in Hotel Imperial, where was the headquarters of the Soviet administration, saying like, communists 3, not 30, only 3, because that director understood that at the end of the line, of course, 30 they expected to hear, not 3. But yes, communists got only 3 seats in the first parliament. But the biggest surprise was with actually who voted. And here is the percentage according to gender. It was estimated that voted women. Actually, they were the majority. And here are the reasons why. Because hundreds of thousands of men died during the Second World War. Many remained prisoners of war and were kept in camps in Soviet Union, so they couldn't vote. And by the special law of 8th of May 1945, together with abolishing the Fourth Right-Wing Party, these former Nazi socialists were excluded, they were eliminated from the voters. So there were at least 3 reasons for such a little percentage of men to be represented in these bulletins, so they couldn't vote at all. So these were women who determined the future destiny of Austria in these first decisive democratic elections. But of course, we understand that women could vote even before. For Austria, it was 1919 when people of both gender, both men and women, could vote. It happened after a long, hard struggle. So yeah, since 1919, Austrian women appeared in the parliament for the first time. So what were the consequences for both KPO and USSR? Because we understand that everything that KPO offered here to Austria and Austrian society was synchronized with Soviet policy. So what were the consequences? I can say that they changed their tactics. Because now everyone understood, yes, women are in the game. We should ask women to become members of Communist Party. If SPO, Social Democrats, by that time already had women movement, for KPO it was super important to invent such a movement. And in between 1946 and 1948, upon the initiative of the Communist Party, the League of Democratic Women was founded. There you can find an acronym for German, which is Bund Demokratische Frauen Österreich. So in English would be the League of Democratic Women. So who were the leaders of this movement, women's movement? Actually, there is no surprise. They were the wives of KPO leaders. It was the it was very vivid feature of KPO as a party. It was their feature. Please remember this tweet. It's very important. So only the wives, the leaders, wives of the leaders of KPO. And to prove that, I prepared a very interesting document for you. Now I will ask you to use your mobile phones. That's all, because I prepared some QR codes for you. So please copy that and then use for your own purposes, because that's the CIA document. CIA document, which were recently declassified, showing us the structure of this democratic movement, Demokratische Frauenbund. After accessing this link, you will get the whole document consisting of 2 pages. Same page, after you open it, will lead you to CIA website, because they offer a very interesting way of studying documents. After declassification of thousands of documents, they offer you access to many of them. You will see the toolbar, which works as Google searching tool. There you can actually type whatever you want. The assassination of Kennedy, Khrushchev, I don't know, resignment. So everything you always wish to learn about. Today we're studying less interesting topic, only the democratic movement, but everything you were interested in, you're welcome to type. It works like Google, so any year, any surname, any street of Vienna, and you will see what CIA agents collected here during the Cold War. And here is what we see. On the left corner, you see the country of documents origin, which is Austria, and then the subjects, officials of the League of Democratic Women. And here are the leaders. Most of them, as I told you, were the wives of KPO leaders. There you will see them both in Vienna, in Lower Austria, and so on, together with Vorarlberg and Salzburg. There you see the date of distribution, which was the 1st of February 1950. So this League of Democratic Women asked justice ministers of Austria and members of the parliament to reform the outdated marriage and family law, which was dated 1811. 1811, that was still in power in 1945. So League of Democratic Women asked to abolish the paragraph 144 that was about the status of a man as a head of the family, because previously the head of the family could prohibit women from pursuing a profession, choose a place of living. The mother couldn't even have the right to sign the passport of its baby. So now the women claimed for equal pay, for equal opportunities, for education, career, and so on. I would say not only this, but also the peace movement, the peace strikes for peace, that were carried on by this organization. And now I have another video for you showing this interesting strike.
Город Сальцбург – центр американской оккупационной зоны в Австрии. Под покровительством американских властей здесь вновь возрождаются фашистские.
we see that this appeared in a Soviet film. Not Austrian, not American, but it was shown on Soviet TV or movie theaters. Of course, Soviet Union was interested in forming pro-communist organizations here in Austria that would be agents of influence. But why didn't they influence directly? That's because the Allies signed a certain agreement in July 1946, by which Austria was provided with some self-governmental rights. So, not of ally, there were 4 of them. US, Britain, France, and Soviet Union could not interfere into the activities, into inner activities of Austria. So, direct influence was totally prohibited. And to prove, not only by CIA document, by a Soviet document, that yes, Soviets were supervising all these democratic, both men movements and women movements. So here is yet another document for you. I took a photo of this document in Moscow when I was working there for 1.5 years before coming here to Austria. That is a certain archive, RGASP, you can Google it, which is Russian archive for politics and social environment. The document dated 1953, and here are the parts that show you, and I would translate, the supervision of Soviets. It says, in January 1953, the League of Democratic Women had 30,000 members, including 21,000 in Soviet zone. In Soviet enterprises, the number of these women was 3,600 members. And though the organization remains weak and do not receive sufficient assistance from KPO, we are looking forward to a new parliamentary elections. So you see, there was a struggle for female electorate, because now, I would say after 1945, women were in the game. So yeah, there was a struggle for female electorate among the parties, and it became quite significant in the post-war Austria. To become an actor or a person who would do something, provide its will. So women could either join the League of Democratic Women or hire for work at Soviet-controlled enterprises and later become a KPO member there. So what kind of enterprises were these? According to the Potsdam Conference, the USSR got some, I would say, Deutsches Eigentum, or former German assets that were located here and here, I would say, and here in Austria. And that's how in Vienna and Lower Austria, Burgenland and Mühlviertel, part of Upper Austria, Soviet administration got more than 400 such former German enterprises and placed it under its control. Through such magazines, for example, Welt Illustrierte, which can be found in the internet as well, Soviet Union propagated an idea of a working lady that can easily hire to these Soviet enterprises, I would say Soviet-controlled enterprises, and then become a KPO member. I know from the interview of a very interesting lady, perhaps those of Austrian origin knows her well, that's Eleonora Dubuis. She is the kind of the war, Kriegswar. She is famous for giving interviews about her Russian father, who was apparently a soldier. And she told me that her sister, her elder sister, used to work at such a Soviet-controlled factory. it was in like 1953, 1954, quite short time before withdrawal of the troops. So the information she provided was very interesting because Eleonora told me about her elder sister that every time while working at this factory, she was asked to become a member of KPO. So thus KPO would gain more women, female electorate, and then would vote for KPO at the upcoming elections. So that was the task of this system. You may ask me about the name of this enterprises system. It got a special name, acronym, yet another acronym, which is UZIA. UZIA, which is Soviet-controlled factories in Austria, UZIA. But what I discovered from Soviet documents, yes, there was propaganda in Austrian magazines, but from Soviet documents I learned that contrary to these propaganda statements offering women like equal rights, equal salary, and so on, of course, people with Soviet citizenship occupied the top positions at these factories. And yes, they were important, but Austrians unfortunately occupied lower positions. So middle managers or even lower positions like accountants, clerks, bookkeepers. So small, yes, important, but still small stuff. And when women go to a workplace, they need someone to take care about their kids. And here is another list from that magazine, promoting kindergartens, which means that here in Austria, USSR applied to its proven method. So it opened kindergartens just like it was in Soviet Union. I would say that social policy towards women was of such kind was an old concept for Soviet Union from the 1920s. And here are some posters of 1920s that were quite fashionable in Soviet time, in Soviet Union, when they tried to promote the freedom for women of all kinds, either from east, west, from the rural area and from the cities, liberate them from household chores, freeing up time for production. And these Soviet-controlled magazines, of course, show the Soviet concept and its politics and policies towards both male and female workers. I should say and add that this, let me show you again, this magazine was used by Soviets as a sort of propaganda, as a source of cultural propaganda as well. And here is the leaflet, which you can also find there at the entrance, about the new exhibition organized by Wien Museum on Karlsplatz, describing the cultural policy of allies, where you can find the policy of America, Great Britain, France, and Soviet Union. So there you will find this magazine, these brochures, these policies. I'm describing just a tiny part of that cultural and social policy. Why I'm talking about that? Because I did a little research for this exhibition, and my name is listed at the final tafel on the wall. So I was really happy to help the museum because, of course, you understand, not the museum itself made this research. The museum asked the University of Vienna, the Zeitgeschichte faculty and Osteuropäische Geschichte faculty. So they know that I know Russian, I can translate, and know a lot about the time of occupation and have access to all these Soviet documents. So it was a big pleasure to work together with university and the museum. So you are more than welcome to participate. You will find very many interesting stories. So there was in all this policy of both KPO and Soviet Union was a little drawback, because KPO supported this women's movement and recruiting workers into the party, relying on the long-term presence of Soviet Union in Austria. Unfortunately, this never happened because the occupation lasted for, I would say, only 10 years, and it wasn't a long-term presence. Which means, after withdrawing the troops in 1955, KPO had no actual support at a place, and rating of KPO fell to 1% only. And since 1959, they had no representation in the parliament and could never influence on politics any longer. However, the left-wing party, the SPO, had a better long-term strategy and tried to implement these gender reforms we discussed earlier in 1970s. And let me show you the person who did this. This was famous Bruno Kreisky. He was one of the leaders and members of the SPO. He was a foreign minister in the following years, since 59 to 66, and was chancellor in Austria. So he was the one who conducted these family reforms. A family law reform was launched right after the elections in 1970. So it was developed by the Justice Ministry officials and, on the other hand, really supported and supervised by this movement of democratic women. So they worked together on this topic. Of course, they had opportunity to participate in that process. And here is the Federal Act on the reorganization, on the personal legal consequences of marriage. There is the QR code following which you can have access to the whole document and then read, because it's enumerated, so it has more than 17 pages, what I remember. But this is the front page, the first one, abolishing the 1811 year legislative, that law, which I showed you earlier. So, what was new to Austrian society right after 1975? This law consolidated the partnership. For the first time in history, the word partnership came to Austrian family language. This law abolished the position of a husband as the head of the household. This law established equal rights in the family for women. So man could no longer prohibit his wife from working, and a couple was now equally obliged to contribute to maintenance of the family. Moreover, the location of the family and the surname was now to be determined in accordance with the principles of partnership, because before the surname was got only after the husband, so it was always husband's last name. Now we have big interest of women towards left-wing parties. This is the graph which I got from a newspaper or a magazine, which I received 2 months ago. So, yes, we see that women rather vote for middle, like Volkspartei, or links, rather than for extreme rights. Of course, we understand that KPO and Soviet administration certainly contributed to all these achievements. They certainly contributed to forming movements, women's movements, and raising women's awareness. However, KPO, unfortunately, did not, or I would say could not gain these fantastic achievements because they relied on Soviet long-term presence, which in reality never happened. This is how the SPO took its move and then advanced in 70s years. Anyway, the questions that were raised in 40s years, in early 50s years by communists, of course, could no longer be ignored. And of course, thanks to Social Party, Social Democrat Party, SPO, whose exclusive presence in parliament and government after 70 years made these projects a reality. This was a big research. The facts that I presented for you only a tiny part of this research, because they combine both the culture, the social policy, the gender policy. Of course, the topic of occupation is much wider. And to study this, I invite you to participate in various activities of Denkfabrik and Dialog Bureau, because this series is just about to start. So, I mean, it's just started, but we're preparing some more lectures and events. I understand that you might have some questions, and you are welcome to ask your questions. For now, this is the end of my lecture, and would be pleased to answer everything you wish to ask me.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering, maybe I didn't catch that. What was the reason, you think, for sort of the Soviet efforts failing? Because you mentioned that the League of Democratic Women sort of survived over a decade and then sort of supervised the reform in the 70s. So why didn't, this movement transform into the seats in the parliament?
Why they didn't transform?
Yeah.
That's a very good question. What I understand, since they were tightly linked to KPO, because they were too revolutionary for 1945. Their ideas were too revolutionary and at that time didn't fit to SPO ideology and program. So that's why they cooperated only with KPO. But unfortunately, KPO was not that popular among the electorate. And each election, they could gain only either 3, 4, or 5 seats. That wasn't enough to bring great influence and to change the situation. While after Soviet withdrawal in 1955, what I understand, they were without any support at all, and only in 70s years, because time flies and of course time changes, and the situation in 1975 was more adequate to their inquiries. So I want to say that the situation between 1945 and 75 was different according to society in general. So it was much easier in 1975 to conduct such a reform rather than in 45, because for 45 it was too revolutionary and there was no chance to change anything. Yeah, so the drawback was that they, right from the beginning, were connected with KPO, which didn't have enough representation in the parliament. So that's how they couldn't influence. If they would gain 35 seats, as Volkspartei did. So of course I believe they would just vote and that's it. But yeah, working together with KPO, unfortunately, couldn't bring this to reality. That's what I understand. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess partially. I mean, I was just curious about this because sort of you mentioned that women formed the majority of the electorate, and maybe you didn't mention it, but I don't know if the two other parties that were participating in the elections, if they sort of presented any agenda for women's rights, and if they didn't, it would make sense for women to sort of vote for those who did something for their rights.
I understand you. The problem was that the other two parties at that time, in late 40s and early 50s, didn't care about women at all. Yes, there was movement, women's movement in SPO, Social Democrats, but they didn't plan any reforms in that topic. So that's how the most revolutionary situation was in KPO. I mean, they supported the most revolutionary changes because it's communists and that's the extreme links, extreme left-wing party. So, of course, they were for revolutionary changes. But yes, the Volkspartei were for conservatives, stood on conservative positions. And what I can add to this, I didn't bring some photos, but if you took photos of these funny newspapers, Arbeiterzeitung, Österreichische Volksstimme, and Wiener Kurier for Volkspartei, if you browse them at Google, or there is a famous digital library, Österreichische National Library. You can Google them and then click to a certain day, the 8th of March, International Women's Day, and you will see what they offered on that day in various newspapers. I checked that, and I can tell you that, of course, the extreme links, communists, they would say like, oh, women are fighting for their rights and let's march along the parliament to fight for our rights. So you understand the revolutionary movement. The SPO would say, okay, we had march, so we had yet another march, we showed that we are women, so that's okay. But the Volkspartei would say, that's funny. So look what fashionable clothes are exhibited at that right corner shop. So these are fashions for the upcoming spring. So you are ladies, wear these dresses. That's the most amazing and funniest newspaper article I ever saw on the 8th of March. So I was really shocked, to tell the truth. So yeah, and that's how women, if those who really wanted to fight for their rights, so which party would they join? Of course, the extreme left-wing party, communists. But unfortunately, communists had little representation in parliament, so they couldn't legally change that.
Yeah, but I see the contradiction here because if they got more votes from women who were the majority of the electorate, they would get the seats, but they didn't. So why? That was the question, why didn't they get the seats even though they represented the rights of women who were the majority who voted for the parties?
For some reason, yeah, that's very interesting. That's a big contradiction, which I also see. Perhaps that was the state of Austrian society at that time. Yes, there were women who really wished some changes, but it wasn't that majority that would vote for KPO. I think that's the point.
Too revolutionary even for women.
Yeah, at that time, because we see what happened in 70s years. In 70s years, they voted for SPO, because at that time KPO was at the bottom, so there were no representation at the parliament at all, or maybe one seat only. So they understood, okay, if we really want something to be changed, so SPO our solution. So in 70s years and early 80s in Austria is the time of SPO and of course women's movement.
I would give you another alternative perspective before the war started. In 1938, the people that were really prosecuted mostly and sent to Theresienstadt were nearly always communists, very extreme socialists, union leaders, and so on. Many of these people as well, a friend of mine, I've met her, Erika Freeman, she's Jewish. Her father was one of the communists sent to Theresienstadt. What was probably embedded deep inside the people because of the Second World War up to 1945 was a distaste of the very extreme left wing and also the connections with Judaism. I think that was going to play a part in their prejudices. Have you researched that?
Not yet, but I know some who conduct this research at the moment. That's at Ludwig Boltzmann Institute. So yeah, and today there is an opening. Well, it just coincided, so she can't be here. But today the opening at the museum exhibition at Traiskirchen in Lower Austria on this topic, because they study the concentration camps and the Jewish people and the communists in these concentration camps. So yeah, so I didn't study, but I know who studied this, and of course it's the next step for me.
Yes, hello. That was very interesting what you said, and I didn't know most of it. But I'm a little bit bewildered about the subtitle, How the Soviets Redefined Women in Austrian Politics. There was quite an active woman movement from before the First World War throughout the 20s in particular, okay, already after the Austrian fascism in 1934, this changed, but still, and many women were also in the working in the underground, in the resistance, not as many as one could wish, and there is certainly a huge difference between industrial areas and cities and countryside. So in the countryside, probably very few women were politically active, but in the cities, in Vienna in particular, you had this tradition. So, and also very progressive women. I think those who returned from Soviet Union, despite the fact that the Soviets tried to present, of course, their system as an ideal system, they knew what was really going on in Soviet Union. You had a totalitarian dictatorship, also after 1945. Quite a few women, also active women, because they were not on the line with the KPÖ, were detained, were sent to camps. All this was also played certainly a role that KPÖ was very little attractive, because there was a huge gap between the propaganda, the nice paper, newspaper, or not newspaper, journal, which you showed, and the reality on the ground by the Soviet, also by the Soviet occupying forces. They were very unpopular. Why? And I think people understood, also women understood, that there is this huge gap between the propaganda and even something they did in this, as you said, factories, employing women, etc., but still, and the very repressive, very also aggressive attitude of the communists against any other political direction. And I think this damaged their reputation, and also, of course, had an impact on the election results.
Yes, I fully agree.
That is my question. Did you look at it? Because did they really redefine something? I question this.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's very interesting. That was a sort of hypothesis. So, at what extent did they really redefine? So, because there was attempt, and we see it in the form of creation, this movement and these factories, social things. So that was a hypothesis.
Social benefits.
Yeah.
For women, yeah.
So I would say they tried to give a lever, a tool for women. Like, okay, we give you the tool, so do something. So this is a sort of hypothesis. About the gap between propaganda and reality, it's true. And that's all about the Cold War and the situation here in Vienna and Austria. And you are welcome to study these newspapers, are indicated here, because reading the newspaper of one day, different newspaper at one day, you see different positions. And that's super interesting how one side represents news, the other side represents news. That's super interesting.
But there was a reality on the Wow, what was happening in Czechoslovakia? The takeover
Yeah.
of the Communist Party, very violent court cases in Hungary. So, and people here knew, if you imagine that
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of refugees or displaced persons came from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, from Soviet
and then
camps.
later on in 56, Hungary, etc. And people knew what was going on in the communist world.
Yes, this free press, which was here, that's what I was describing. So they represented the other side. So communists would say they propagandistic ideas, and the other newspapers of Volkspartei or, for example, SPO would represent the reality, so the other side.
And the Allies as
Yeah.
well. They had also their media. The Allied forces, the Western Allied forces, US.
Well, that's a good question. That's about the cultural policy, I would say. And there at this exhibition, there are some examples. You will see the copies of these journals and magazines which were issued by allies. But generally, they would support any of these newspapers. That's why that's super interesting.
It's different from Germany.
That's really super interesting, because when I say like KPO newspapers, in reality Soviet-controlled newspapers. When I say Volkspartei newspaper, in reality that's American supported newspaper. That's the core and the logic of the Cold War. So yeah, there were some individual newspapers of allies, but generally allies would support any of these newspapers, so they would fight against each other, even in the media. Yes, and American-controlled newspaper, Arbeiter Zeitung, which was always against Österreichische Volksstimme, KPO newspaper, you understand, Soviet-controlled newspaper. So Arbeiter Zeitung would always give truth, like, and it's super interesting to read them. You just again, please have a look at ONB, so Österreichische Nationalbibliothek. They have digital forms of all these newspapers. And they would give the truth. That's true. Perhaps that's one of the reasons, and indeed, I understand, one of the reasons why people at first were, and later were afraid of KPO, because they knew what was going on. According to Arbeiter Zeitung articles, they knew what's going on in camps. And moreover, most of the war prisoners here to Austria, they came from Gulag camps. And of course, they had the first-hand information. So that was one of the reasons why KPO just lost all support after withdrawal. So that was very interesting remark, thank you. So it just revealed various topics, like the Cold War, the battle between these newspapers, and truth and reality, and the gap between Soviets and Soviet propaganda and reality.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for your remark. I would like to add to yours actually question. What's your answer to the question which you pose here? Because to me, it also looked as if the Communist Party was trying to hijack the movement which was already there, and the tendencies and the kind of advancement of women movement and women-centered ideas which existed in Austria back then. If you compare, for example, with Switzerland, where women got the right to vote in 1981, and Austria in 1919, so it would be good to understand how you answer the question in the end. When you know, what was in Austria, what was outside of Austria, and the tools which were given seems like were of no use or little use, because it still was the pace of the Austrian women's movement, which was developing as it was supposed to be developed, and the tools were not that much influencing the situation.
Yes, thank you for your question. I would answer the following way. So I judge, well, it's my personal approach, but I judge according to the results. So I judge the results. Since there were no results after this movement, during the occupation time. So actually, it wasn't that powerful. The significant role was, of course, of SPO in 70s years. That was the most powerful move, of course. That's what I understand. So perhaps they tried, but never reached the results, while the actual results appeared only in 70s years. So I would say tried, but never happened.
So kind of throwing the bridge towards the present day, right? These days, there are a lot of talk of trying to have, some soft influence or direct influence through media or other way of, trying to infiltrate into political parties and doing all types of covert things. But as we see from this example, is that even when you have the local agency, like the local party, which has the possibility to promote certain agenda, if you have a very big distaste, I guess, or lack of reputation, like KPO had, they never get public support. Was there any example of the policies of the Soviet Union that you're aware of, which actually sticked, or which was later borrowed more or less immediately once introduced by other parties or other parts of the Allies, which really found some following?
That's a very good question. Let me think about it, and when I find the answer, I think we will have the post. Perhaps, yeah, so we will post then in both Denkfabrik and Dialog Bureau, because only one thing which now comes to my mind, that this democratic movement, Österreichische Demokratische Frauenbund, they raised this question, because never earlier SPO before SPO raised this question. So for the first time it was raised by this movement first by the leader of KPO in 1945, and later by this democratic women movement. The question to change the policy, the family law, the social policy and the family law, they raised this question, but the solution came only in 70 years. That's the first which comes to my mind. About other policies, I should think and revise all my documents, because there are thousands of them, both Soviet and CIA documents, because they're super important. So yeah, after I get the whole answer, the whole puzzle, I think we can make a post then. So post the information.
Cool, thanks. I guess we can then thank Olga for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to you all for your coming and using this possibility really to learn about this interesting and important history of Austria and in the European context. Thank you to Olga for this great lecture and also the discussion we had later. And yes, for your contributions to it, because it was also worth to hear. Also on democratic movement of women in Austria. Thank you to Artyom and Denkfabrik, yes, and to our team from Dialog Bureau, who worked a lot also for this event. This was the first event of our series on making the Second Republic of Austria, but we are already inviting you to the second one. That will be in the end of May, most likely the 27th, but we will inform you timely. And this will most likely be on the question of sovereignty of Austria, on the state treaty of 1955, and what were the conditions of this sovereignty or not sovereignty, and how ended this occupation time. And of course, you feel that it's again very interesting for today, because the war against Ukraine is going on. The main task for today is really to ensure for Ukraine to keep sovereignty and to have guarantees of security and to keep the territories and the people. And this means what could be a way to this very important goal. I ask you all to follow as information of Denkfabrik and Dialogue Office, Dialog Bureau, and what are the developments in the frame of this war against Ukraine, and please join initiatives for support Ukraine. Follow also the developments within Russia, and where you can really support initiatives which would part of democratic forces who support political prisoners, and that is really also a big need. Describe to our newsletters and use the business cards you will find there, which is with all links and addresses and QR codes where you can find us. And be involved in this fight also for gender equality, for anti-discrimination, and in general for democracy. That is also important today. Thank you for this coming evening, and we will have a coming after event meeting now. Thank you.